Good morning again, everyone. I hear lots of nice fellowship and discussion, but yeah, ask that we quiet down. We're going to get started here in just a moment. So you need to do one more refill on coffee, do so, and all that kind of stuff. But what we're going to be doing today is there was a note about in the newsletter this last week and everything, but is this idea of how we as Christians. I'm going to wait until everybody quiets down just a little bit. Thanks, Bryce. But this whole notion of how we as Christians, it says consuming media in our culture. The reality that we're bombarded by lots of different things, and whether that's news media, whether that's television shows, whether that's social media, it's all over the place, and it's always constant. And so I think over these next several weeks, we'll likely do this maybe for the course of the summer. We'll see how everything goes. I kind of see what you guys like about it and what we all want to dive into. But I think it's a really important thing, just with the world we live in, the scope and the nature of, again, all the different ways that we're bombarded with information. So what we're going to be doing today, though, is going to be a little bit different once we get into the class about how I want to do it. I've got up the plans for the class: overview, purpose, rules, principles. We're going to kind of try to get through most of this today, maybe next week. I'm just kind of laying out how I want to approach this, and a little bit of just ideas about what this means. And anyway, let's just dive into it. So the overview of the class, though, and this is what, after we get through the first week or two of just kind of some of the principal pieces, and really what I want to do is take various media clips. And it might be watching a short, snippet of a news program. It might be watching a short snippet of a television show. It might be even looking at a snippet of a social media feed, or looking at a commercial from television, a variety of things, and looking at it, and then to do really two things. To kind of talk a little bit about the context, where context, strategy, values that, from a worldly perspective, what is this thrown at us when we watch this, when we see this, when we read something like that? Unpack it a little bit, and then transition to faith discourse. And the way to transition to faith discourse is going to be kind of talking about from the lens of whether that's first, second, third article of the Creed. What is this saying about who God the Father is, or what is it saying that's antithetical to that, or what is this saying about Jesus Christ, or that's antithetical to that of the Holy Spirit? But also then really diving into 10 Commandments. How are the things of the world asking us to look at it from a worldly perspective that is, again, antithetical to what God's told us, and how God's called us to act, how God's called us to live as his followers in this world. And again, so the idea is to, as we dive through these clips, to talk about developing a critical eye about how we consume this. I'm not here at all, to be clear, to say that we shouldn't watch the news, or we shouldn't watch television, or we shouldn't be on social media, or this is somehow we should be insular from the world. I absolutely think these things are important. And I think it's important to be informed. I think it's important to be engaged in our culture, even, so that we can better understand how we can be witnesses to who Jesus is. But to do so with a critical eye and a discerning eye for how it impacts us, and how it can then be useful for us as followers of Christ. So why is this important? 1 John 2:15-17. This is the do not love the world or the things of the world in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. And just for me, I think it's pretty clear, but maybe this is easy to gloss over these passages sometimes too, about what John's writing here. The fact that living in the world means that you are engaged in culture. You are engaged in reading the news. You're engaged potentially in watching television. You're engaged potentially in social media. In some ways, we need to be aware of those kinds of things in order to be better understanding where somebody's actually at when you get that opportunity to witness, to talk about who Jesus is. If you're completely isolated, how are you actually going to be able to understand have a better sense of what their hurts are, or what their struggles are, or what kind of questions they might have in terms of their role, and frankly, the fundamental question of how are we reconciled before God?
Our sinful nature.
Our sinful nature, yeah.
Wants us to be in this world.
Yes. But I also think, as much as you look at 1 John 2, it says not looking at worldly things. I really mean more the second part of it, of not looking at them in worldly ways. I mean, how much we're bombarded with advertisements and commercials that are calling us to covet the things that we don't have. You got to have this next thing. You got to have this other thing. You got to have this new gadget, this new car, this new whatever it is. Or how often the ways the news media is presented to us, that's done in such a way it's the headline that captures your attention, and it captures your attention either through anxiety and fear, or maybe it's this, you got to know this. And how often does that then become presented in a way that's asking you to fear and love and trust in something other than God? Breaking the first commandment.
Mostly money.
Mostly money, absolutely, as Harlan said. I'm going to read the Romans 12 passage here quickly too, and just this idea for a developing discerning eye, and then I'll stop for a moment for more comments and just thoughts about why you guys think this is important as we're trying to consume culture or consume media in our culture. Romans 12, 1-2, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercy of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So again, as we're consuming the culture of the world, we're consuming the media of the world, and all those different topics we're talking about. Again, I think it's important to know those things. I think it's important to be engaged in a way so that we can be good witnesses of Christ. But as you consume it, to not conform your mind to the way that it gets presented, or not conform your mind to the same fears or anxieties or covets or the litany of different, breaking the fourth commandment of not honoring your leaders, not respecting authority. Whatever the example is, there's just a litany of examples about how the world is constantly telling us to act in a different way than what God's calling us to act. So I want to stop there just for comments, thoughts about, again, why this is important as we're thinking about media in our culture. We're thinking about us consuming it and what it means for us as followers of Christ as we're trying to think with a critical lens, a critical eye for how we want to be informed and engaged, but also in a way that isn't worldly, as John and Paul write about here in their letters.
It's like a lot of people in this world believe that just because it's on TV or a podcast or something, it's true. So there you go with your discerning eye about what is true and what's good.
Absolutely. I mean, especially when you talk about the Romans 12. So just so everybody, Carol heard, just because you see it on TV, just because you see it on a podcast, just because you hear it, do you automatically accept and know that it's true? No. You see it on your social media, on your Facebook feed, it could be a whole bunch of nonsense. And to use that discerning eye by prayer and supplication, asking what is the will of God that he's putting before me? Other thoughts? Rick?
I think it's easy to get into a mode of thinking that we're in some sort of unique situation in history. But in reality, I think this is a condition that has existed forever. I mean, you think about Pilate talking to Jesus. What is truth?
Yep.
I mean, so it's somewhat timeless, although the type of media that we consume is probably, obviously different through time. But that discernment, I think, is something that has been an issue all the time. I mean, there's some reason that they put it in their letters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a really good point. I mean, the issue of discerning truth, the issue of being in the world and out of the world clearly has been here for 2,000 plus years. The thing I'd say that, and we'll get into more of this as is that the scope and the severity and the amount of information we have access to now is so substantially different than any other time in history, in my opinion. I saw a hand over here. Jennifer? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I found that as a Christian, I have to kind of be careful about what I see and watch. I don't want to be so easily swayed to do something. So I use a lot of filters I don't like something, I just change the channel. But I also use all the techniques and tools on social media to, you know, kind of guard my faith in a way.
Oh, absolutely. Everybody hear that all right? Okay. Just the notion of guarding your faith in terms of when do you change the channel? If you got a TV show on that is just wrong or makes you uncomfortable, you just don't want to hear it, or even just being conscientious of how you're on social media to filter it and be cognizant aware of what's getting presented to you and whether it's helpful or not. Yeah.
I think education has a lot to do with this too, in the terms of how we've seen it change over recently, in terms of teaching us critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
I think that's had a lot to do with what people just going along with what's there. And that's happened over a number of years.
Yeah. Just the idea of how are we actually being taught to think critically, and how are we actually using our critical thinking skills as we're, in a sense, you didn't say this exactly, but even just thinking of Romans 12 and trying to discern what the will of God is. Prayer and supplication, you know, going before God and saying, is this what you want for me? Or just even praying and saying, as I on my social media feed or as I'm watching the news, help me be cognizant of what it is I actually need to know. Gloria.
I was just saying, what we've been seeing, like you said before, it's just been over the years, many years, and they do it subtly so that you don't really see it coming until all of a sudden it's very blatant. And so you get sort of conditioned to some of that media, whether it's social or whatever. We get conditioned to that to think, well, that's the norm.
Yep.
Or that's normal, until you realize, you know, you check against the scriptures and you're like, okay, I gotta uncondition what they've been conditioning me to believe is true.
Yep, I'm gonna add to that. And Laura was just talking about the conditioning, kind of what happens of what you've gotten used to. And I think even, you know, at least in my lifetime, it seems the amount of ratcheting up in terms of the amount of ways that headlines get used to capture your attention and capture your attention either by you need to know this right now, and capturing it by anxiety, preying upon your anxiety and your fear. Did I see another? Oh, Harlan, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, there's so much violence on television, movies, and everything, you know. And then no wonder these kids are going out and buying guns and shooting people. They think that everybody's going to get up when they shoot, but that's going to happen. You know, it's not like what they have in movies and video games and that kind of stuff. You know, it's just
Harlan's just
they wouldn't let their children watch that stuff.
Harlan's just commenting about the fact of how much violence is in our face every single day. That's modeled for us, frankly, and how that might be impacting clearly the behavior of kids, adults, whoever else it is. I feel like I've seen a bunch of other hands. I'm trying to keep Stu. Yeah.
I'm wondering a little bit about this is focused on like information or misinformation. It feels like a little bit, but sometimes I'm interested in learning a little bit more about either differentiating or assigning ownership to this to a person. In other words, how do you treat a person who has a different opinion, different way of life, different kind of things that they do from the actual information or thing that they do?
Yeah. So
does that get in the way of us relating to that individual?
So I think it's really good questions. And so just so everybody can hear, it's a little bit of, as you're using this discerning eye with whatever information that somebody might have, and I'm going to use an example actually that I plan to talk about here in a second, just to kind of piggyback off this, but the idea of how are you discerning someone if they've got a bunch of information that's maybe even just misinformation, it's inaccurate. So I'll just go into it. Here's the example I saw. This was shortly after the Roe versus Wade opinion was leaked and all that stuff. And I was on Twitter. And it was this Twitter feed. It was this long Twitter feed. And I was going through it. And it was just a bunch of different people that were taking examples of scripture and just fundamentally misappropriating what it meant in order to justify why God would not say that abortion is wrong. And for me, in that sense, it became helpful, I thought, I'm going to read through this so that I've got a sense of here's how this is being framed. And I don't like thinking of sides as much because I think everything's nuanced. And especially if you're reading Twitter, you don't really know these people, you just have statements. And so as much as I just take these statements to know, here's some statements that are getting made publicly on a social media platform that's misappropriating scripture. So if for me, if I get in that spot the next time that is potentially talking to someone that's in that spot, I've at least seen a little bit of understanding what it's like. And so Stu, to your question, I think it's twofold. It's one, thinking through it critically again. So this happened to be Twitter. So I got to think conscientiously about what does it actually mean that what got said because of the platform that it is. Again, that I don't actually know these people. This is just the statements they happen to make, which maybe they would never make in an interpersonal communication, but they're happy to make it on Twitter, or they wouldn't say it the same way that they said it. But then also then to think through how does then those examples of misappropriations of scripture become helpful for me as a follower of Christ if I happen to actually meet that person or someone like that, so that I'm better able to engage and talk to them about who Jesus is and what those scriptures actually point us to. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, partly, and then I guess also just that if somebody says something that's blatantly false or stupid or whatever.
That never happens.
I think we have an explanation to say that statement is the sum and substance of that individual, and it gets in the way of us having a relationship with that person or discussing things further.
Oh, absolutely. So, and yeah, I see what I don't know if Stu heard, but the idea of someone says something that's just blatantly false, blatantly untrue, that rather than actually engaging with that person, I'm paraphrasing what you said, rather than engaging that person, you just kind of put that person as, oh, this is that other over here that's not me. I'll just put them in a box over here that they don't get it. And you don't actually take the time to then live in the world and not of the world and engage with that person. You just dismiss them somehow because clearly their mind is in whatever, dark tunnel of misinformation that they're in. So, Carol.
But sometimes it's your family talking, and then you don't want to become confrontational of them no matter what. But boy, it's
Yep.
hard when it's your family that's got all this misinformation.
It's tricky. So I don't know if everybody knows the first slide, but I said overview, and then I talked about kind of, I don't know what I call it, reason for this, but the third bullet up I had was rules. So before we get to watching any clips, I've got some rules. So this is important because the whole confrontation that can happen with family members. Frankly, we're going to get into some stuff potentially that might be difficult to talk about. We might even watch some stuff that maybe you completely agree with what's said, and maybe you watch it and it just completely makes you mad. So what I've got up here is media clips may often include comments on difficult issues or come from media sources you like to watch regularly or even don't like or would never watch. So if I put up a Fox News clip or an MSNBC clip or CNN clip or whatever the example is, what I'm asking us to do is not get stuck on the issue or where the information came from. I've got media clip on gun safety up here as the example. We could sit here in the class and discuss all day what we think the Second Amendment means and where we all feel about the Second Amendment and whether there should be any regulations to deal with school shootings or not, and whether we think et cetera, et cetera. But the point of the class is not to figure out the Second Amendment. The point of the class isn't to figure out whether or not you like Fox News or you like MSNBC or whatever news sources you like to watch.
But Pastor Dan, what if I just need to let you know exactly how right I really am?
Are you speaking for yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Asking for a friend. gonna kick me out of the class.
I mean, just think, so again, think about it that when I want to present these clips, and we're gonna get into some theory stuff in a minute about why I think the news media presents stuff the ways that it does. And I think that's gonna be helpful kind of to give some principles about what this is really gonna look like, where we're actually talking about institutional structure and what their motivations might be, and some of those kinds of things that then can really set the groundwork. When I said, again, the idea is you watch the clip, you talk about the strategies and the values that that might convey, and then you move to faith discourses. If you really want to be right, you could say what you want to say to be about right, but I'm asking that we stay away from that, because I think the important piece is to talk about how is the process of us consuming information and consuming media in our culture then transition to what we think about our faith. And I don't think that talking about whether what we think about the Second Amendment is going to be helpful for really fundamentally making that transition to what it means for our faith as we live with a discerning eye for the world as followers of Christ. I think it ends up becoming a distraction for, I think, what we want to do in this class.
So
Joel.
in this class, we could kind of substitute one issue for another, but we're gonna learn kind of relational skills and maybe some secrets on how to just put up with a little bit of stuff while we live, get to know people, like Stu saying, right?
Well,
Because it's not about gun safety, it's not about this one
But
thing.
not the stupid people. No, not that.
again,
I got you off track. That's-
no, but
That's what I think I'm coming.
Yeah.
I think that's what.
it's about transitioning to the idea of relationships like Stu was talking about, which I think is part of what you're saying. I think it's also partly, if you think about a media clip for gun safety or a media clip about a gun shooting or whatever the thing is, rather than talking about the Second Amendment, let's talk about, again, is this calling on you to fear and love and trust in God, something other than God? Is it preying upon your fear to act in some way that's other than how God's calling you to act? Is it preying upon what your views about the fourth commandment, honor your father, mother, but even an authority, about questioning the authorities that God's put in place for us? Is it calling upon you somehow to break the eighth commandment and then also share something that is, as Stu said, something that's just fundamentally not even true? To talk about those kinds of things rather than whether we're going to solve the world's problems. Because we're going to solve the world's problems much more fundamentally and much more eternally, obviously, if you are able to transition into a faith dialogue with someone rather than a dialogue about what we should do about gun control or whatever the example is. Is all that clear outside my head? All right. Now we get into the stuff that I think is really fun. So I'll try to keep everybody awake. No, actually, I think this is really good. There's a guy named Neil Postman. He's written several different books. And he really gets into epistemology, and he gets into this whole notion of how we know what we know.
What's epistemology?
Yes.
How we know what we know.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm going to pull some stuff. He's got a book that he wrote that's called The Disappearance of Childhood. And I'm not going to go into all the different, but this is some of where this comes from. And I've got this Henry David Thoreau and Telegraph. So we're talking 1860s about when Henry David Thoreau made some of these comments. So he starts off, and this comes from Neil Postman. It is alleged that upon being told that through the telegraph, a man in Maine could instantly send a message to a man in Texas, Thoreau asked, but what do they have to say to each other? In asking this question, to which no serious interest was paid, Thoreau is directing attention to the psychological and social meaning of the telegraph, and in particular to its capacity to change the character of information from the personal and regional to the impersonal and global. This whole notion that, and we'll get into more of this too, but this whole notion of just not that there isn't something that could happen in Texas or Maine that we don't need to know about, but usually we don't need to know about it, really, in terms of fundamentally what you're doing with your day. In terms of fundamentally about, I've got this question up here, principle number 1, what do you need to know? in order to be a follower of Christ. And if we're not thinking about what we consume in terms of media, either in a way to be able to just kind of put it aside of, okay, that was interesting that I learned that once, but that's not really fundamental to who I am. Or to consume it and think about it again as the Twitter example that I gave of, here's something that I can put in the back of my mind that if that opportunity comes that God puts before me, here's a little glimpse of the world that I can know of. And there's things we just need to know, weather forecasts. If my kids want to go to the pool this afternoon, it's helpful for me to know whether it's going to rain or not. But it's not really helpful for me to know whether or not it's going to rain in Maine.
No, it's Spain.
It's Spain, yeah.
On a plane.
Harlan, yeah, Harlan's got his hand
In
up.
regard to our faith, we need to know what is true and what is false and follow what is true.
Yep. Follow what is true, Harlan just said. Mom, Cassie? Yeah.
Which one?
Yeah.
When everything shut down in 2020 with the pandemic, my anxiety went off the charts. Because I have asthma, which makes me more susceptible to COVID issues. I have two sons. One in a former life was a research analyst who knew a lot of stuff about stuff. My other son is a research scientist. And they both said to me, Mom, how much news are you watching? And I went, well, how much, Mom? And I said, a lot. And Daniel said to me, they're selling you a product. And Ben said, sent me a research article that he participated in that talked about if you watch news more than 15 to 20 minutes a day, it starts to psychologically affect you. That short of time. And they held me to it. They parented me.
So I'm going to go on with a little bit more postman here, but definitely ask questions if we're going to spend as much time on this as we need to make sure this is all clear for kind of how we're again framing these principles in terms of these ideas about how we're consuming media. But this is postman again. In any case, the answer to Thoreau's question is finally that it doesn't matter what a man in Maine has to say to a man in Texas. In part what I said about the weather, but also through the telegraph, men did not say anything in the sense Thoreau used the word. What the telegraph did was to create a world of anonymous, decontextualized information in which the differences between Maine and Texas became increasingly irrelevant. The telegraph also moved history into the background and amplified the simultaneous and instant present. So I'm going to stop there because I've got that bulleted up. When I think about the simultaneous and instant present, and again, I'm talking about the telegraph here to be clear. We're talking about the first aspect of electronic communication that's able to connect things. I mean, clearly we're all well aware that 150 years later, the exponential scope of how much electronic communication has changed since then. But I think it's profound the fact that they were talking this way 150 years ago. But if you talk about the simultaneous and instant present of where we're at now, how many have a phone in your pocket right now? It's on the table. Yeah. How many different times in a day does your phone ding at you with a news alert or an email that you need to read or a social media post of someone says this? It's just constant. And everything is always presented as right now, you need to know it. Right? You need to know this right now. It could be the 22 things you need to do to get your mental health under control. The 15 things you need to do to finally get your house clean. I'm just throwing out easy ones, those types of things you see, and it's this constant, and again, then there's no context. There's no context of whether you actually have a mental health issue and really even need to read mental health, let alone whether that article that just popped up on your phone or your computer or wherever it is actually helpful to deal with that issue. Or whether you're struggling with trying to keep your house clean, is that the thing you need to know right now for your day? Your phone just popped it up right now, but it presents it like you got to know it right now. And you got to act on it right this second.
These things hear you. You
Yes.
say, I should clean my house today, and then you get the 15.
Yep.
Ways to clean your house.
Stu,
Is it entirely that it's presented as being need to know right now, or is it that it's being presented in such a way that it floats to the top of all other stuff?
well, I think it's both, because I think with the inundation of so many different sources, headlines and things get presented to try to float to the top because they know that there's a sea of information.
To me, it's a lot like having the trash magazines in the checkout counter at the grocery store.
Yep.
As opposed to that it's in other words.
Stu, please, that is Pulitzer Prize winning journalism.
Yeah.
Please.
Where's the Grit magazine with the people?
I know, right? My phone thought that I needed to hear about Johnny Depp's trial in both English and Portuguese. And I was like, I don't care in two languages.
Is that because it wasn't the right language?
Huh? It's because our phones are linked, so it just sends it to both of us like all the time. Yeah.
I just came back from Germany and I now get news things from Czech
Okay.
and German
Auf Deutsch.
and one other. I can't remember, but it's
Eins,
Can't
zwei,
read it
drei,
anyway.
Deutsch.
I shut my off. So I didn't read it all.
Other thoughts, comments, or questions if this isn't clear about this, postman stuff and Henry David's Row and everything. Rick, yeah.
I got a little bit of advantage because you showed me the whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, I think there is, though, a difference in terms of how those events impact us because of this globalization of information. What used to affect an area regionally or locally now starts to impact nationally or internationally the way we think about it. And so, to the effect that is it relevant? Probably not, but it does impact us because it changes the way we and the people around us think.
Yeah. I definitely think it changes the way we think in terms of the globalization of information. I've got this up here, news from nowhere means news from everywhere. We definitely get news from everywhere.
It changes the timeliness too, because like you said, now it's being forwarded to the top.
Yep.
You gotta know about this now.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe you don't care, but somebody wants you to.
Yeah. But even Rick, to your comment about relevance, I think it's tricky, and I think that's one of those things that in terms of what do you need to know is really being discerning about relevance. Is it relevant to me to know what's happened with gas prices? Yes and no. Yes, because I gotta be able to balance my budget. Yeah, Jen, sorry.
So, the telegraph, what year was that invented? 1860.
I think it was 1861, but
Okay.
yeah.
So I would contradict what you're saying about not, having irrelevant information by saying, well, now we have communication superhighway, and to Rick's point, and we also have a extremely mobile society that you can be in the other side of the country in a matter of hours, not days, not months, not weeks, hours. And people have family and friends all over. So it's a different world than it was was in 1861, that's for sure.
No, I definitely think so. And I mean, you made two comments, obviously, the ease of access. I'm looking at people across from me that just got back from Germany, and the ease to go to Germany in 2022 versus 1861 clearly has changed dramatically. And really, when I talk about this stuff with the telegraph, I think it becomes important because when really, if you think about before the telegraph, things couldn't have traveled any faster than a person could carry it. When it might have been Pony Express if you're talking mail,
That was fast.
and that was fast.
when it came out.
But you're also talking about, because of the fact that that's the way information would have traveled, you wouldn't have gone from Maine to Texas to tell somebody something in Texas unless they really needed to know it. And now what it is that information's coming regardless of whether we actually need to know it or not. And so I said gas prices, yes and no. Yes, I got to be able to know how I can balance my budget. If gas prices are going to be $4.50 a gallon like they are right now, and I know that it's going to cost me $60 to fill up my car instead of 40, or whatever the numbers are. But I would argue that it's also not important to know because there's not really much I can do about it. I don't need to spend my time worrying about gas prices. I don't need to spend my time, in the throes of the fear of the way it gets presented, as if I need my constant, daily update about what gas prices are.
Or combing the media, find where it's cheapest.
Yeah, combing the media where you find where it's cheapest, and even admittedly, though my grandparents would sometimes drive farther, I think, than to find the cheapest gas station in Lincoln versus, I think you would have, but that's neither here nor there, but
It's a true statement.
yeah. But my point of that is that, yes, I need to know what gas prices are, but I don't need to know to the degree and to the speed and the constant simultaneous and instant present that the way it gets presented to us as if it's this glaring problem. Because I mean, I have no control over the oil supply. I have no control over what's happening in the stock market and oil futures. I have no control over what's happening in OPEC. These are all things outside my control.
But what if I have a well-worded tweet?
Let's,
Then I could have some control, Pastor Dan.
yeah. How would that well-worded tweet give you an opportunity?
It's gonna mean that somebody listens to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, not really. Not maybe.
I was gonna ask who listens to you because you have no idea.
Say what now?
I was gonna ask who listens to your tweet because you have no
No
idea.
one listens to me.
Yeah.
No one listens to my tweets. No.
And how would that well-worded tweet help you live as a follower of Christ?
That might be detrimental to my faith walk, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah. So,
Well, I think I saw this either on a documentary or someplace about the telegraph and the start of the Civil War. And at least some people, I don't know who it was, scholars or what, but they wondered how we could even have a Civil War, have a war, because we had the telegraph, which meant really good, by that standard, really good or very fast communication. And I just thought, well, that is fascinating to think that, they thought, why would you even have a war? Would you communicate?
the idea of the technological advancement of the telegraph in this instance by sharing the information would diminish or decrease the misunderstandings or whatever you call it. Yeah. But
So of course, that hasn't happened at any time in the last 160 years.
it's maybe frankly gone the other way. Steve, do you have your?
Just add that, this is not a subject. I think Abraham Lincoln was the first world leader to have the telegraph. And so he spent a lot of the Civil War in the Army telegraph office, nervously awaiting news on the battlefronts.
Yep.
That was the first.
Rather than having to wait a week for somebody to walk or ride a horse or days or whatever it would be. Yeah.
He can make instant decisions, relay them to his generals.
Yep. Well, we've got 5 minutes left, so what I want to do is I'm going to finish this Postman quote, but we'll come back to it next week because I think there's more to discuss with this a little bit. But then I want to give you kind of an assignment between this week and next week, just to kind of think about. But first, let me just finish the quote. I'm going to start from the idea of news from nowhere means news from everywhere. News from nowhere means news from everywhere about everything and in no particular order. The Telegraph created an audience and a market not only for news, but for fragmented, discontinuous, and essentially irrelevant news, which to this day is the main commodity of the news industry. And again, think about just the exponential scale compared to what he's talking about here with the Telegraph. Prior to the Telegraph, because of the technical difficulty of communicating information through space, news tended to be selective and pertinent to the lives of people, which is why Thoreau posed his question. After the Telegraph, news became unselective and unusable, at least by the measure of a man like Thoreau. Indeed, and this is this in a sense for this whole thing. I mean, there's lots of really good information, but this is the key quote to me of all this stuff from Postman this morning. Indeed, it's stretching the point only a little to say that the Telegraph helped create a new definition of intelligence. And actually, I've got this up. The Telegraph helped to create a new definition of intelligence, for as the world became flooded with information, the question of how much one knew assumed more importance than the question of what one made of what one did know. I can just know more stuff, and I can just know more stuff because it's coming to me from all over the place. I can know what's going on in Maine if I live in Texas. I can know what's going on about the weather wherever, even though it doesn't have anything to do with whether I take my kids to the pool today. But we just got to consume more. We just got to consume more. We got to consume more. And our media is presented to us that way. Again, the whole through fear or through consumption, this idea that you just got to know more. And so my assignment for all of you today is this next week, between now and next week, when we talk about this again, is just to really just kind of having that thought as you see stuff. And I'm not asking you to change your behavior. I'm not asking you to not be on social media if you usually are. Not asking you to not watch television if you usually watch television, whatever that's news or whether that's sitcoms or whatever it happens to be. But as you watch stuff, just have that question in your thought about what do you need to know to be a follower of Christ? And as you're thinking through that, is this just information that somehow is important because I'm gaining more information? Or am I really thinking about what one made of what one did know? How am I actually going to use this information to be a disciple of Christ? How am I actually going to use this information to potentially have a conversation with someone one day about abortion? How am I actually using this information to create a relationship with someone because, you know, maybe it's somebody that loves such and such television show, and that's how you start a conversation with someone because you both laugh and you think the show's hilarious. Because I like watching TV. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't watch TV, but maybe you watch that television show and then you're talking to somebody at the grocery store or whatever happens to be, and you get to laughing about that show, and that sparks where God opens up that door that then transitions to faith discourse at some other point down the road. So again, what do you need to know? And then thinking through the lens of whatever it is you consume this next week, and come back ready to talk about it next week. Whatever it is you consume this week, think about it from the standpoint of what do you need to know? And is this just information that I'm gaining because it's just more? Or am I actually thinking about what am I going to do with the information that I've consumed as a follower of Christ? All right, that's all I got for today. See you next week.
We are 99%.